Okay, let's get going. 10:43 a.m. on April 27th, 2022. I'd like to call this meeting to order of Kane County's American Rescue Plan Committee. Clerk, please call the roll for attendance.
Bates.
Here.
Brown.
Brown present.
Ross.
Ross here.
Gums.
Gums here.
Kenyon.
Kenyon here.
Leonard.
Leonard here.
Martin.
Martin here.
Molina.
Molina present.
Strothman. Tepe.
Tepe here.
And Sanchez.
Sanchez here. Someone asked for unanimous consent to approve the minutes of April 13th, 2022.
Tepe so moves.
Any objections? Minutes are approved. Public comments on agenda and non-agenda items. Is there anyone present here that would like to deliver a public comment to the committee at this time, or anyone online? Hearing none, we will move on. I have no comments this month. Meant to take that off, sorry. Program manager update, Mr. Phillips.
Just very briefly, we have requested expenses for all the Big Six Mental Health One awardees. We have not yet received expense detail from them, and we are about to request the next set of document package from the competitive grant awardees. And the timing of this is mostly tied to adjustments, some of the documents we have for new guidance with Treasury, but we're moving along. So we anticipate we should probably be getting expenses to assess from the Big Six this week for check disbursement. And that's all we got.
Excellent. They've been spending money and we're going to be reimbursing them now. That's the plan. That's the goal. Any questions? Yes. Any questions for Mr. Phillips? Okay, we'll move on. This is going to be the main portion of, I was going to say the show, but this isn't a show. Main portion of the meeting today. Eligible expense update, a conversation with our consultant firm, Ernst & Young. So Mr. Phillips, would you like to just lead us into this, please?
Certainly. We have Gary Burke from Ernst & Young. The whole team for Ernst & Young has been assessing a number of different the eligibility categories based on questions that committee members have raised thus far. And of course, as you know, we collected some questions from committee members over the last week and a half, specific questions, but we've also, Jenny, done a lot of work looking through past minutes to look at some of the other not so official questions that people have to kind of get a breath of how we want to look at and how we think you want to look at the eligibility categories. So Ernst & Young is going to spend some time today talking to us about that. And as well, the State's Attorney's Office, Steve Ford and Vince Coyle distributed a memo that they've worked on pretty extensively that you have all received. There are a couple hard copies in the room if somebody would like one. But this is this memo goes into detail about capital use. So with that, I will turn it back to Mr. Sanchez.
Yeah, if anyone wants a copy, I just have two more. We can get some more printed, I think, if we need them.
Thank you.
Anyone else need a hard copy? We can print them real quick in the back. Just came in hot off the presses, so.
Mr. Chairman, Shepro.
Mr. Shepro, before we continue.
Yeah, could someone just stick a copy in my mailbox upstairs?
There was.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Thank you.
An email too from.
Yeah, there's an email as well, a digital version, but we can put a hard copy in your email.
Yeah, if you already have a copy,
Okay.
I'll take one. Otherwise, I'll print it. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So Gary, I think, is going to lead us through this. Gary, do you need to share screen? If so, I think that Blair, everyone has permission to share a screen. They should, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Sanchez, I think we're not going to share a screen today.
Okay.
We're just going to go over the questions that we received verbally and then document it in the ensuing days. So, Mr. Sanchez, I'll let you disagree. I thought we would go through a few prepared remarks, kind of indicating what we've done in the landscape in which we've addressed these questions, and then go through the questions one by one, and then offer time, if you agree, to the committee members to ask questions that we may be able to answer during this meeting, or we can take away and do the diligence and research to fulsomely respond to their questions.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Proceed.
Thank you. So first of all, it's great to be back with the committee today. On behalf of EY, we've really enjoyed the engagement with the county and the collaboration between the committee chair, and the program manager and the SAO. So as it relates to our conversation today, we've researched the questions provided to us by the ARPA program manager, Mr. Phillips, and discussed our observations at a high level with the SAO. As the county's spending plan becomes clearer and specific projects are identified, we will continue to refine our research regarding the specifics of the county's plan and the related compliance and reporting requirements related. As EY cannot provide legal advice or opinions, we will continue to liaise with the SAO in its provision of legal services to the county. We, EY, will continue to provide our interpretations of the guidance in the county's plans that are formed based on our understanding of the guidance, our subject matter resources, and our experiences serving other recipients of the Treasury's funding. I'll address a number of the committee's questions and then ask my colleagues, Sarah and Will, to also respond. But before I address the specific questions, I want to touch briefly on the available state and local fiscal recovery fund guidance, or Slf-Rf. There are three primary pieces of guidance. The first is the final rule, which is 117 pages in very small font that was added to the Federal Registry in January of 2022. The second guidance is a 44-page overview of that final rule. So it's 44 pages overview of this 117-page final rule. The third is the compliance and reporting guidance supplement. That's 43 pages and last updated on February 28th, 2022. A couple of points from the guidance that relate to the county in previous conversations. First, the guidance allows for the replacement of lost revenue, which calls for the quantification of lost revenues and then calls for a description of how the county spent the funds on the provision of government services. I should note, government services is the most flexible use category under this ARPA program. And I think of lost revenue as a two-step process. First is the quantification of the amount eligible for lost revenue or revenue recoupment. And the second is to determine how to use the funds for the provision of government services. And again, those government services can be activities that the current county budget doesn't support with expected revenue, and or special projects that would align to traditional government services. The second macro point that I wanted to address is workforce compensation and personnel matters. As we'll discuss in some detail, the guidance allows for both the reimbursement of county expenses that is paid to frontline employees, and also allows for increased compensation to new or existing county employees. On the reimbursement side, the guidance that allows for the reimbursement of costs previously paid to public safety, public health, and human services staff. This would include sheriff, public health officials that are primarily dedicated to responding to COVID-19. It's important to note that these amounts would be reimbursements to the county as opposed to compensation to the individuals or employees of the county. The second type of workforce support is related to government employment and rehiring of public sector staff. And this would represent an increased compensation to current or prospective county employees. The main categories of this particular type of authorized use is first, restoring employment to pre-pandemic levels. So as you look at the county's overall employment, if it has suffered due to the pandemic, you can use these ARPA funds to restore the FTE headcount to where it was prior to the pandemic. And you also have flexibility to increase FTEs, increase full-time equivalents above the pre-pandemic level by 7.5%. So it does allow you
What's
to
an FTE?
full-time equivalent. So it's based on 40 hours as opposed to a singular person.
And you said 7.5%.
Mm-hmm.
The other category is supporting and retaining public sector workers and includes several subcategories. The first is providing additional funding for employees who experience pay reductions. or were furloughed since the onset of the pandemic. The second is maintaining current compensation levels to prevent layoffs. This also would include adjustments for inflation. The third is providing worker retention incentives. And this category does include reasonable increases of compensation to persuade employees to remain with the county's employment. Finally, premium pay is also allowed for under the fiscal recovery funds. This requires a three-step analysis and is ultimately limited to $13 per hour with an overall cap of $25,000 per employee. So with that overview, we'll go to the specific questions that we've received. The first question is, what is premium pay and what county employees or duties would qualify for the premium? Again, premium pay is think of hazard pay. It's meant to compensate public sector employees for the risk of being exposed to COVID-19. And the three-step analysis would include identifying eligible workers, and the ARPA guidance lays out 25 categories of public sector employees that would be considered eligible. Then the second part of the analysis is to identify the essential tasks that the worker was performing, and with delineation of it has to be done in person and would have to increase the risk of exposure to COVID-19. And the third would be more of a quantitative approach to appreciate that the amount of premium pay would not, exceed not only $13 per hour of the 25,000 total cap, but would not exceed 150% of some compensation thresholds that are nuanced and detailed within the guidance. So premium pay is allowed for. Does premium pay allow for retention bonuses, stipend, and or the like? We'll break this down into two sub questions and rephrase it slightly. Premium pay does not allow for retention bonuses or stipends, et cetera. It allows for additional compensation for the increased risk of exposure to COVID-19. However, as I mentioned earlier, there are other categories that would allow for retention bonuses or stipends or the compensation to promote the retention of public sector employees, especially in the county. Next specific question was, what is the difference between premium pay and the county workforce support initiatives? Again, premium pay is quite specific. And again, it's compensation for increased risk to COVID-19. So an example would be if a person during the pandemic has worked 100% remotely, that individual would not be eligible for premium pay. However, based on the other eligible uses of ARPA funds, that employee may be eligible for an increase in compensation in order to retain them at the county. The next question is, can the county use the Slf-Rf funds, so the state and local fiscal recovery funds, for workforce support, specifically to hire new employees or to give employees a raise across the board? Does that money need to be tied to an employee connected to the pandemic, or can be applied in any category of public employee? So there's a lot of questions there. So yes, the fiscal recovery funds broadly can be used to support workforce support initiatives to increase headcount, FTE, to the pre-pandemic level, or increase it to 7.5% above pre-pandemic level. So that would include hiring back to those levels. It also would include retention bonuses or other compensation necessary to retain the county's employees. And then finally, the broad workforce incentives do not necessarily need to be tied directly to the pandemic. It has a broader definition. However, if the county were to explore premium pay, there are more defined definitions that need to be complied with in order to use the premium pay, and that would be specific to individuals that were responding to the pandemic or putting themselves rather in a higher risk of contracting COVID-19. Will, I want to pass it over to you for the next set of questions.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to present. It's been a pleasure working with Mr. Phillips and Mr. Sanchez and the rest of the members of the county on this. And so The next set of questions are also related to pay. Next question being, can we use ARPA payroll reimbursement towards increasing the county employee salaries so that they are competitive with surrounding counties? The short answer is yes. The final rule does offer flexibility, and Gary already sort of spoke to the premium pay opportunities, as well as some of the other categories available to essential workers and government workers to increase salaries. There is a caveat that there may be some just written justification necessary based on the thresholds that are provided in the Treasury guidance, that we can sort of delve into the specific amounts once those specific salaries are identified. But basically, the answer is yes, that you can use ARPA payroll reimbursement for salary increases. Second question, how can Slf-Rf be used to retain employees? We can use it for retention bonuses, education stipends, and other incentives, including the premium pay that we already spoke to. These are designed to help influence employees to remain with their current employer. And then the next question is related to the revenue recruitment calculation. Does it consider inflation effects, cost of commodities, services, and labor? Short answer is yes. The revenue recoupment calculation considers inflation effects, which is calculated using the Bureau of Economic Analysis's implicit price deflator. And that was built into the calculation that Mr. Onzik from Finance completed. And he's, more than capable of speaking to that, and we're happy to talk more to that if necessary, but we've been working with him on that as well. So with that, I'll kick it over to my colleague, Sarah, and she'll go into a few other questions.
Thank you, Will. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this topic. The next set of questions pertain to construction and capital projects. How can this funding be used towards capital projects, such as setting aside money for future government building? Can capital projects be funded through an expenditure category that is not government services under cost revenue recoupment? So to parse that apart, generally, yes, you can fund capital projects under lost revenue replacement or other expenditure categories. The key parameters are that the money must be obligated by the end of 2024 and spent by the end of 2026. So if there is a broadband infrastructure project, for example, that construction can continue to the end of 2026 as long as the contract was in place by the end of 2024, in theory. So some other examples are the expansion of healthcare facilities, parks and green spaces. The spending does need to be related to the pandemic, but this is a very broad umbrella under the final rule. And it really depends on which expenditure category the county would use. Gary, do you have any comments to add on this point?
No, I don't. Thank you, Sarah.
Great. More specifically, can we use Slf-Rf for construction additions to buildings or to make repairs / modifications? This is definitely a nuanced section of the rule. Depending on the expenditure category used, new construction is permissible, modifications, additions are permissible. It's really the repair item that repair is distinguished from maintenance, which is more of a gray area, with maintenance generally not being allowed. So depending on the county's preferences and priorities, we can work through that. But yes, in general, construction is allowed under the rule, but it is a more complex section.
Yeah, Sarah, if I can just add to that, the complexity really lies with the nature of the construction project itself. If the nature of the project is related to infrastructure or broadband, as an example, there are defined categories of eligible uses for that type of construction project. If the construction project is related to the expansion of certain facilities to fight COVID, that again would be very directly tied toward the public health emergency and would be a category for the capital expenditure. However, if the expenditure nature is more of a repair to a government building or expansion for government services that isn't tied necessarily to the pandemic, then you can still use the ARPA funds to fund that project. However, it would not fall under a specified expenditure category. It would likely have to fall and be a decrement to the revenue recoupment amount that the county clarifies or quantifies, excuse me. So that in that example, where it doesn't have a specified expenditure category per the guidance, the amount of the project would decrease the amount of funds that the county government may have related to the use of revenue recouped dollars.
Thank you, Gary. One of the final question we have is sort of in an other category. And I know this is a top priority for the county from our meetings. The use of funds for opioid crisis recovery programs and diversion programs through the court system and sheriff's office. Yes, these are eligible uses. They would fall under two different expenditure categories under the final rule. For opioid, that does, broadly permit the use of funds for response and mitigation to the opioid crisis. It does not limit the type of departments that can receive those funds. There are illustrative examples of how that money can be spent and some parameters in the text that we can help with. In terms of diversion programs, this would not fall under the opioid treatment section in the rule, but more broadly under the provision of government services related to public health and safety. So we are seeing examples of municipalities provide funds to police departments, fire departments, and for these types of programs. Treasury, in fact, highlighted an example from Honolulu this past year. That was a $6.5 million pilot program to address homelessness, which was jointly funded through the police department and the public health department there. So definitely permissible, and just we would need to look at it from the two different areas of opioid crisis response versus government services. I think that brings us to the end of the questions, and we're happy to discuss any of these specifically or other questions.
Sarah, I just wanted to add one point to illustrate really the mental health, because there is a specific enumeration related to mental health. And it states the expansion of access to evidence-based services for opioid use disorder prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and recovery. So it's fairly broad language in the guidance that allows for the use of funds to support the opioid epidemic that's going on currently in the country. On the diversion, more broadly, I think when we were speaking with the SAO, there's perhaps different ways that the county has defined diversion programs. And so as Sarah was indicating, based on how those are defined and in the nuances within each of those programs, a deeper assessment would be required to identify which category might be the best for that particular project. So Mr. Sanchez, excuse me, with that, that's all of our prepared comments. We're happy to take questions or provide clarifying commentary based on the committee's questions.
Excellent. Thank you all for presenting that to us. I'll take some questions at this time. Mr. Leonard, I saw your hand first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my question is general in basis, and what it is I understand that we have many flexible options with this ARPA money, which I'm very grateful to know about. And since Ernst & Young has dealt with other government entities. I was wondering if you could tell me maybe what expenses we should stay or reimbursements we should stay away from, because it seems to me like generally speaking, we have a lot of flexibility to use this money as long as we word it properly and state the need properly. So I'm just wondering if there are any real roadblocks that we should know about before we don't discount anything.
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me answer from two different perspectives. I think one is, I think all the uses that are enumerated within the Treasury guidance are, I think, a good use of funds. The second point is that this guidance, as well as other federal guidance, limits the funds and requires the evaluation of duplication of benefit. And so with that in mind, I look at some of the infrastructure projects that are eligible under the SLF-RF of ARPA, and I compare that to some of the federal funding that's available out of the IIJA, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. And there are some conceivable overlaps of projects. So to the extent the county was considering a project that may be eligible under the IIJA, I would recommend using those funds under the IIJA and leaving the ARPA funds for other projects that aren't fundable from the IIJA.
Well, thank you very much. I think also too, you had pointed out earlier that with respect to duplication of sources to refund or reimburse, we have also looked at and evaluated any FEMA options and discounted those from the ARPA monies too, if they did qualify for FEMA.
Yeah, that is definitely a best practice we're seeing across the country, for sure.
Other questions? Any questions from the committee? Okay, I did see one come in. What consideration would be given to capital purchases for things like air conditioning and heating systems or air handling systems, boilers and hot water heaters? We're not repairing, but replacing with new, more efficient and better air quality, water quality, and energy efficient solutions. These would not be maintenance, but capital purchases and replacements. Mr. Burke, do you have a?
Yeah, that requires further research and also identifying the county's plans surrounding those pieces of equipment. To the extent air handling, as an example, was an eligible expense as it relates to helping with the prevention of the spread of COVID-19, I think that would clearly fall within this guidance. If it's a replacement of an HVAC in the courthouse, as an example, that would be quote unquote routine or necessary, just the normal life cycle of the building. That's where we would need a little bit more refined research to appreciate the justification of why it might fall within this funding.
Okay. Any other questions for Ernst & Young while we have them on the line? No? Okay. I think it gave you guys all a lot to think about. So that's good. And obviously the recording will be available if you need to go back and listen to precisely what was said later on. Madam Chair, go ahead.
Sometimes, hi, thank you. Sometimes my mind works a little slower as I'm trying to figure things out. I'd like to go back to the workforce support initiatives. To hear you clearly, if we were to offer a retention bonus or a increase in compensation, that would have to be expended through, we would have the opportunity to expend that through 2026.
That's correct. It's a bit nuanced based on the type of program that would be offered, but the broad period of availability or period of performance per the guidance is March 3rd, 2021 through December 31st, 2026. The nuance, just to highlight for premium pay, some of the language related to premium pay is tied to the public health emergency. And there is an anticipation that may end prior to the conclusion of 2026.
That I can appreciate, but I'm not speaking about premium pay. I'm speaking about retention.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so that retention can be paid through the end of 2026.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, if you do have any questions that come up after this meeting, just send them to Peter and myself. We'll make sure that they get passed along to Ernst & Young, and then they can provide a memo response to these questions. All right, well, thank you all for being here. Gary, Will, and Sarah, we'll be talking to you soon.
Okay, thank you for having us. Have a great day.
All right. Okay, let's move on. Selecting a special meeting date. I just put this on here. We had discussed the potential of voting on the spending plan that was produced at our last meeting at a special meeting that would precede our executive committee meeting date. Is that still something that this committee is interested in to get moving along so the spending plan gets put onto the May County Board agenda? Or do we feel that we need to wait for anything? Some of the information we got today, does it change your mind? I don't know if Mr. Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering if you could send out or Jennifer could send out what we had agreed upon at that last meeting, or at least what we looked at, so we could review that, take into consideration what we've heard today, and then maybe alter that a bit.
Okay, so what I can do, I can share, I updated the table. Let's see, hold on one second. And it's not showing.
It's okay. You know, it's
yeah,
just.
I have it, but
Good. We just would like to look at it again, have a couple of days to think about whether or not, yeah, we really do like this, or we want to make a few changes to it.
well, okay, so what I would suggest, if we want to do this on the timeline that it could potentially get it to the county board in May, that we set the special meeting and any amendments be brought to that meeting to be discussed and
Sure.
and hashed out at that point to try and get it along. If
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Tepe.
Tepe here. Would that include the internal request? That's, to me, one that's been hanging for a while, and we haven't really, in my time, in my opinion, we haven't really gone through that list to say yay or nay, and that's a big chunk of what we're talking about.
So as far as the departmental requests, we did the group exercise. Everyone reduced their list by some amounts, at least for the most part. And
I
think,
didn't, unfortunately.
Yeah. But it seemed everyone was in agreement with the list as is when we discussed it all in total in our previous committee meeting a few months ago now, I think.
But then I believe you went back to the departments and said which ones could be eliminated.
Yeah, so we did have some reduction in, for instance, the contact tracing request from the health department is moot because we passed a resolution already.
Understandable, but as I say, I think that needs to be moved up, and we need to, I think deciding those will make a big change in the numbers of any amount of funds that we might have available for other options.
Yeah, so this is the updated. There were a few minor changes that occurred from departments after our last meeting. So originally the number was 41.2 million. It went up by a few $100,000, and it just made sense to round it just in case. Some things could come in at a little higher price, and obviously we can always adjust this later on. This is just the spending plan. This is the guide. This is how we will structure it, whatever the final form is. So that dropped the number here. Oh, this is supposed to get updated. Sorry. 11.3 is the new number here. I wasn't prepared to show this right now. So, but you get the idea. I'll send you, I sent the previous one to everyone that was sent to everyone. So you can refer to that for now, but otherwise this is where we're at. And so when we're talking about things like, capital and payroll, or, things with workforce and all that, it was referred multiple times. Some of this may cut into the government services portion here. We don't know. This is a number we just don't know. It's a lot of unknowns in this category. So keep that in mind. But then down here, this to be determined, that's money that can be used for, well, we have to figure it out. So
I understand, but by my logic, my thought is, if there's a bunch that we can agree upon, let's get them going. Okay, and let's get the funds allocated and not just assume that we're going to approve all of them. So I don't know, I'm just trying to.
Yeah,
push.
that
Just trying to
hasn't been
push.
brought up. I think the idea for many committee members has been, let's fund everything that we approved in our group exercise.
I'd be
and,
shocked at that, but okay.
Well, if there's an objection, I mean, we can go in a different direction. Otherwise, the idea is to pass a spending plan, and then that means we can start getting to work on those projects that were requested.
All right.
Because it'll take a lot of time to develop our methodology and tracking and bookkeeping and things like that. Madam Chair, do you have a comment?
I'm going to go back to the retention, the workforce initiatives. So we're looking at $25 million for government services and payroll reimbursement. A payroll reimbursement, I believe, is for the premium pay for COVID relief.
For public safety.
For public safety. As that is winding down, and we may have potential conversation about workforce support, what budget line are we looking at? Is that coming from the first one or?
It would be from either or
25?
this top line here and this bottom line here, the to be determined amount.
Yeah.
You know, Mr. Chairman, we also have workforce support too.
That's what I'm
which falls
talking
into
about.
that.
That's-
So not
that's-
just hazard, there's two separate
I'm
areas.
not talking about hazard. I'm
Hazard or
talking about
premium pay.
workforce support.
Okay, good.
So where was that going to be coming from again?
It could come from either this to be determined, assuming the eligible category is there, or government service payroll reimbursement.
But payroll reimbursement is going to be reduced because of hazard pay. COVID-related expenses are going to be dwindling now.
Yes,
Knock on wood.
yes. Yeah, and that's, as we discussed at our last meeting, there's a lot of risk involved in really believing that those numbers in that category are very firm, because we saw what happened with the increased revenue that came in this year, and we weren't able to collect any revenue recoupment except for our loss on an investment, and that was it. We didn't collect any other revenue recoupment. Mr. Leonard?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think also under departmental requests, that some of that is workforce support pay also. Some of those requests in there are for additional people, other types of pay that this gives us a real general broad stroke of where we can use it, but it's not like one thing can only go into one category. It could go into a couple of categories. And with respect to the workforce compensation, that could go into the government services payroll reimbursement and also departmental requests, because they are requesting more monies for additional people or whatever.
Yeah, we would go through the process of determining all the department requests and what categories they can be eligible for in our reporting. And that would be our next step once we know that we've approved either the final amount or some reduced amount.
Chairman?
Ms. Bates?
So to speak to Mr. Leonard's point, I don't get it, because I thought most of the projects were more like putting in, like for water, it's doing a study for water sustainability in the Foxborough. I didn't think it was for raises.
I believe if I recall in the state's attorney's request and also the circuit clerk's
Okay.
request.
Judicial and public safety.
Yeah,
Yes.
that there were some of those types of requests in their asks.
Okay,
So,
all right.
Mr. Frost,
Which category would revenue recoupment come under?
that's the top line. That's government services. So we can recoup the revenues that we lose based on the formula and use that money for government services. So it's a sort of an interchangeable term, revenue recoupment, government services. Yeah. So yeah, this would be the starting point from our discussion if we were to hold a special meeting next week. This would be the starting point, and then any amendments would just be the natural course of a resolution, as it is for any other committee. Mr. Martin?
My understanding of the letter and the presentation, and I think Mr. Leonard made the comment, we have great latitude as to what we do with these funds, as long as we properly word what we're doing to meet appropriate categories. So this guideline here basically creates the pot. And then we need to apply to it what we want to do. And it would seem to me that the bottom line is, either going to go up or down depending on what we've done in the other two categories. So I mean, I don't want to become root bound in trying to determine specificity at this stage in the process, because it just seems to me we're going to weave through it. We're going to determine our priorities, and then at the end, we're going to have a certain amount of money left that we then have to discuss. But it just seems to me, as long as things are legitimately categorized, we have significant latitude here and ought to approach it from that standpoint. If there's an expense that we want, we need to say, how do we fit it into the grid?
Yeah.
Is what it really boils down.
Yeah, this is more than
Well, yeah, I mean,
20,000 foot view.
I'm saying all this with the assumption that it's going to be appropriate, but the answer is, if there's something we want, the question is, where's the appropriate resting place for it? And we just do it. And when it's all said and done, we see what we have left.
Yeah, this is the 20,000 foot view. And as we go along the timeline, we're going to fill this in with much more details about what we'd like to do. I mean, that's
I think
just
what
all
this
there is
does
to it.
is to kind of, it lets us kind of acquire a state of mind as to how we begin the process. But we're a long way from knowing who's here, and I'd like to just resolve it so that we could begin the process of actually assigning priorities and expenditures.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest practical results of passing a spending plan is that we can get going on the department requests as well.
That's what
which
I was
have
going to
been-
ask you.
They've been waiting in the queue, as they say in grid.
I think the item on the table is, do we want a special meeting? And I think yes.
Yeah, is there any objection to a special meeting? Looking at the calendar, it's a bit of a busy week next week. It looks like Monday would probably be the best day to do it. So with that, Monday morning, 9 a.m. our normal meeting start time. Mr. Martin?
Question, is the intent of the special meeting to vote on this?
Yes.
And we don't have the resolution before us, so we can't do it today? I mean,
Correct. Yeah, the resolution wasn't ready and the expectation today was to speak with Ernst & Young and then decide on this next step today. So the resolution will be passed out, I believe, today. It's ready to go. So 9 a.m. Monday morning, does that work?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We'll get that on the schedule, on the calendar. And yeah, again, like as Mr. Leonard said, take this presentation from today, start getting your thoughts going. And if there's any kind of changes you'd like to see here, that's what we'll discuss on Monday. But keep in mind, this is the overhead bird's eye view of the whole thing. Ms. Bates.
The second.
Do we have a hard drive somewhere on the county hard drives that contains all of the documents that we've been receiving?
Yeah, so we do
I
have
would
a
appreciate
SharePoint
that.
site, and now that we're past the real high level grunt work of the other programs, that the community support grant program backend stuff, we're going to be updating that SharePoint site. So there's most of the stuff that's on there now is pretty up to date, but we have to.
Can you give us access? To
Yeah,
that? Do we have
yeah, everybody
access?
has access to it. We'll go through that again. I think if we don't have a video, like a walkthrough video already, we'll have one made.
Well, I need it before that special meeting.
Okay, yeah, I'll
Like
You've got access to it now.
today.
send out. Yeah, we'll send something out.
That's Monday the 2nd, right?
Yes.
Monday, the 2nd, 9 a.m. And that will be the only item on the agenda.
And can we have on our hard drive, these resources that Gary talked about, the final ruling, the overview?
Yeah,
which
those are there.
Would be good,
Mhm.
44 pages instead of 100, although I did read the final ruling, and then the supplement. We have those on the hard drive.
Yeah.
I read the 125 page.
All the reference documents.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Was fine print.
Okay, any other questions or comments before we adjourn? No? Okay. Mr. Kenyon? Moves.
get on the road and start reading. Okay,
For a second.
I'll get out my yellow highlighter.
All those in favor of adjournment, aye, say aye.
Aye.